You are here to learn about the history of the world's most famous airliner, which is, of course, Concord. It's the world's only successful supersonic airliner, an aircraft that could carry 100 passengers wherever they wanted to go at more than twice the speed of sound. When Concord was introduced, nothing like it had ever been built before, and nothing like it has been built since. I say since because these aircraft have now been retired for 11 years, since the end of 2003. Of course, the history of Concord reaches back considerably further. The aircraft flying for the first time in 1969, the same year we landed a man on the moon. The actual history of Concord begins in the late 1950s, and I have found people can understand this a little bit better if they know what it was like to fly in the years before Concord. Now, these are aircraft that did become very well known for flying back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, most frequently between New York City and London. When they were introduced in 1969, this had only been possible for about 30 years. You could first buy a ticket to cross the Atlantic Ocean in the late 30s, in the years just before World War II, and back then, flying was considerably different. For one thing, airliners typically looked like this. These aircraft were known as flying boats. They were built to take off and land from water, and this was vital in the 1930s, as back then, most of the world did not have airports. If you wanted to fly in those days from New York City to London, this required several refueling stops along the way, all in places that at that point did not even have runways. While these aircraft were very successful, they were also extremely expensive to build and to operate, and this meant that ticket prices would be extremely high. To fly one way across the Atlantic in 1939 typically cost about $675 US. Today, about $6,000. This meant that only the very, very wealthy could afford to fly, and that would not really change until after the Second World War. During the war, aircraft technology would advance very rapidly. As it did, flying would become cheaper, and every year, more people would fly. As airlines began to notice this, they realized shortly after the Second World War that this meant that they would need larger aircraft. What you have here, the largest plane on Earth pre-World War II, could carry just 75 passengers. Now, after the war, larger flying boats would be built. This is an example of one built in Britain in the late 1940s, known as the Princess. The Princess was large enough to carry over 100 passengers in a two-deck passenger cabin. Unfortunately, the aircraft was also so incredibly heavy that it required 10 engines to fly. Now, this meant that the aircraft were extremely expensive. Nobody wanted them. Only 3 would ever be built. People realized in the late 1940s that the era of the flying boat had ended and the era of the jet plane had begun. Ladies and gentlemen, this is actually a private tour. If you're not booked on the 3 o'clock Concord tour, I have to ask that you step away. Thank you. So, the world's first jets are military aircraft built during the Second World War. This is an example of one built in Germany known as a Messerschmitt 262. Similar jets would be built and flown in the United States and the United Kingdom at around that same time, and technology from this first generation of military jets would lead to the first commercial jets about 10 years later. The very first of these aircraft, built in Britain in 1952, would be known as the de Havilland Comet. Now, the Comet would be the ancestor of all the jet airliners we fly today, but it was different from modern jets in many, many ways. It was more elegant than modern jets, but it was also smaller, carrying only about 55 people. Now, because of its small size, these aircraft could not carry enough fuel to cross the Atlantic, but they were the fastest airliners on Earth in 1952, and so they were sold to airlines all over the world. Unfortunately, because they were an entirely new kind of aircraft, they possessed flaws that were not understood when they went into service, and they began having accidents very, very early. In fact, just 2 years after their introduction in 1954, 2 of these aircraft would explode in midair shortly after takeoff. This was extremely frightening, as at that time, nothing like it had ever happened before. These aircraft had to be grounded for a while the accident would be investigated. What they learned, while everyone believed that it would be Soviet sabotage, was that the cause of the accidents was something much more subtle. Early versions of the de Havilland Comet had square windows, as you can see in photographs like this one. The corners of these square windows magnified the stress of high-speed, high-altitude flight. Every time the aircraft compressed or decompressed, it would create more stress. After about 900 flights, the corners of these square windows would begin to develop cracks, and after about 1,000 flights, the aircraft could experience what was known as explosive decompression. This is a very serious problem, but there is one good thing about it. Once that problem is understood, not only is it fairly easily solved, but that will make flying much safer for us today. De Havilland would eliminate the problem by 1958, when they introduced an improved version of the aircraft known as the Comet Mark IV. The Mark IV was much safer than these early Mark Is, having round windows and considerably larger, carrying over 100 passengers and having much larger fuel tanks. In fact, in 1958, a de Havilland Comet made history by being the very first jet airliner to fly non-stop across the Atlantic. Unfortunately for the de Havilland Company, just a few weeks later, Boeing would introduce the 707. The 707 was sadly for de Havilland better than the Comet in basically every way. It was more efficient and easier to maintain. Unfortunately, it also carried a great deal more people than the Comet did, over 180 passengers. With more seats, they were much more profitable. By 1980, Boeing would sell more than 1,100 707s, and in the same period of time, airlines would purchase less than 120 de Havilland Comets. De Havilland can't compete with the 707, but here's the thing, neither can anyone else. Boeing can simply take the design, modify it, producing the very famous 747 of the late 1960s, and more recently the 787 Dreamliner. Every one of Boeing's 700 series airliners goes on to sell over 1,000 units, with the Boeing 737 selling more than 8,000 units, becoming the best-selling airliner in history. And for many, many years, there is not a manufacturer on Earth that can compete. So companies like de Havilland have to compete in other markets. They will, for example, build smaller and cheaper aircraft for shorter flights, but they are not the only aircraft manufacturer in Great Britain at that time. They also have the British Aircraft Corporation, and it is they that decide to build the first supersonic airliner. Now, many companies around the world came up with this idea at about the same time. In France, a company called Aerospatiale was building a plane called the Super Caravelle, or designing it. The Soviets would begin developing a similar aircraft, as would we in the United States. But what each would realize is that the supersonic technology available at that time was so expensive that to build an aircraft alone would be almost impossible. Supersonic flight was at that time only about 10 years old. The first aircraft to do it, the Bell X-1 of 1947, an experimental aircraft, really nothing more than a rocket with wings, designed to get one man past the speed of sound as simply and efficiently as possible. It worked very well. What we learned from it allowed us to improve. A couple years later, there would be an X2, then an X3, then an X4, and so on and so forth, up until the X-15 of 1959. This, another experimental aircraft built more than 50 years ago, the fastest piloted aircraft ever constructed. Capable of flight at speeds more than 3 times greater than Concord, over 6 times the speed of sound, and at such an incredible altitude that several of its pilots did technically become astronauts while flying. Now, not that guy, but you may recognize him. That's Neil Armstrong, 8 years before he became the first man to walk on the moon. This, again, a rocket with wings. It's not about what we can do with the X-15, it's about what we can learn from it. We learn not only how to shape supersonic aircraft, but we also learn that for an airliner, rockets will not be a very good idea. So we improve our jet technology at the same time. It will be just a couple years later, in the early 60s, that the fastest jets ever built, the Lockheed Blackbird series. These are about 50% faster than Concord. They can do this because they weigh a lot less. These are about 95% titanium and have a structure that's roughly 2 millimeters in thickness. They really are extraordinarily lightweight. They are, however, also military aircraft, meaning no seats for passengers, no room for luggage. Concord, you will see, is not very large either, but it seats 100, and 100 is a lot better than 0. However, if more seats is better, it is 1 month after the first flight of Concord that the very first 747 will fly, some of which can carry more than 600 people. These aircraft, if they're available, why would someone buy a tiny thing like Concord? Well, these take about 7 hours to cross the Atlantic, and Concord's average was less than 3.5. Now, by about 1961, the British have realized that while they know how to build a supersonic airliner, they're not going to be able to do it alone. The supersonic technology available in 1961 so expensive that to build such a plane would have bankrupted the British aviation industry. So in 1962, they asked us to help them build a supersonic airliner. We say no, and so they will very shortly afterwards sign an agreement with the government of France. BAC and Aerospatiale will then collaborate on the construction of Concord, and in the end the aircraft will each incorporate parts built by each of these companies, with the first prototype flying in 1969. At the time, the airlines of the world find this incredibly exciting. They believe that by the 21st century, by today, all airliners would be supersonic. This is not the way history unfolded, as we all know. A big reason for that is that by the first flight of a Concord prototype, this program had cost almost $1 billion. It meant that the companies behind it wanted to begin selling it as early as possible. So while the first flight took place in 1969, the first orders for Concord began to be placed in 1963. That year, the very first day, in fact, 3 airlines will option Concord. 2 of them everyone knows. Air France, and what is today known as the British Airways, but was known back then as the British Overseas Aircraft Corporation. These are, however, the second and third airlines to order Concorde. The first was in those days the largest in the world. I'm referring to Pan American Airlines. They placed the original order for Concorde in 1963, and in 1967 would begin running ads like this in magazines like Time. This ad illustrated what they believed they'd be flying just a couple of years later, an American supersonic airliner at the bottom that was never actually built, in the middle of Boeing 747 at the top Concord. And at the time they were so certain they'd be flying these aircraft that they'd also produce newspaper, radio, and television ads, and even merchandise like Concord toys with the Pan American logo. Toys like this are now quite rare and worth a great deal of money because Pan American would ultimately be prevented from flying these aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid this is actually a private tour, so I have to ask that you kind of step away. Thank you so much. The big reason that Pan American could not fly Concorde, one of the big reasons anyway, is noise. Any aircraft that flies faster than sound will create a series of shock waves, creating a noise that we know as a sonic boom. These shock waves, created by compressed air around the plane, are created continuously as an aircraft like this flies faster than sound. Meaning, it's not just happening when the plane breaks the sound barrier, but wherever a Concorde would go, the noise of the supersonic boom would follow. If you were to try flying such an aircraft, for example, from New York City to Los Angeles, California, it would affect each and every person living along the flight path of the aircraft, meaning no one knew if the public would tolerate that. We had to find out before Concorde entered service, so in 1964, an experiment would be done in the United States called Operation Bongo. Operation Bongo had the U.S. Air Force fly supersonic jets back and forth over Oklahoma City over the course of about 6 months, generating more than 1,200 sonic booms. What they learned was, of course, that people did not like that very much. Aside from the irritation of the frequent booms, there was a great deal of property damage, hundreds of broken windows around Oklahoma City, and so, by 1970, the American government would simply ban supersonic flights within the United States. This unfortunately meant that Pan American could not fly Concorde at all. Rather than immediately canceling their order, they decided to wait and see what would happen. Unfortunately, what did happen would not be helpful, and it would be the fallout from Pan Am's eventual decision that would cause Concorde problems for many, many years to come. Now, we're going to make our way out to the aircraft momentarily. If at any point during the tour you have questions, please let me know. And if you've brought cameras with you, photography is 100% okay. It's totally fine. Regular photos, flash photos are all good. I do ask, though, that you please do not film